we basically think that side government wants to change sugar daddies in Africa. They want to move from China, which is giving them everything, to the US, which would still be giving them everything. It's just as imperialistic, but it's different in one regard. By tying the US to it, it cripples the US efforts to fight against human rights abuses, to fight against bad labor conditions, and to really make an economic success overseas. We're going to go over this by 2 points. First, we're going to talk about the nature of developing economies and how we think side government is not rightfully attributing the purpose or the reasons that there's child labor and there's environmental disasters, because all developing countries have them, whether they have China or not. The second thing we're going to talk about is how we're simply shifting the imperialism, but this time it's the US, and we're basically putting it in new ground. The US has never quite been, or Western countries would be more imperialistic in China than they have been in the past. But first, I have 3 points of refutation. The first one comes from first half that talks about sweatshops, right? And they basically say that when the US companies invest, they create like kind of pseudo-US companies in other countries that don't really have to abide by their standards. We think the same thing would happen in Africa, right? US companies, when they operate overseas, have worked in the past in terms of violating labor conditions and human rights abuses. It's happened in the past, they've just found a clever loophole for it. The second thing that we think happens is you create this idea abroad that when the US is investing in other companies. We think that this is really kind of funny to say that this is the solution to the problem, because if you listen to the first government team, they said the way that China is buying up Africa is by taking over African countries, right? They say that they're investing and buying up the major share of Chinese companies and then taking away their resources and investments. We think the US is doing the same thing too. They're simply saying, well, we should invest in companies. Investing in companies is code for buying shares and taking over from a corporate level. No, thank you. They simply are shifting around but using some clever differences in language to try to justify it. It's simply ridiculous. The second point that we have is taking land too, right? Because they seem to have the idea that, well, China is taking land and resources, but the US wouldn't be taking land and resources. We think that they would, right? Because to stop China, you'd have to get it from somebody else. And what they're saying is the US should be the one to buy it, either directly or by taking over African countries, or companies, not countries, and then buying it up. That's what they're saying. They're just saying we need to change who takes over. It doesn't solve for anything, and in fact, it's even worse. No, thank you. The third point that I want to talk about is sustainability, right? Because they've talked a lot about sustainability. But the best, in terms of economic sustainability, not environmental, the best asset that Africa has to raise money right now is their land and resources. They don't have the developed economy that requires the natural resources that another country would, like China would. So what they can do right now is sell them off to other countries and get an influx in capital. Right now what they're doing is they're exporting dramatically, which brings money into their society, which means they have more jobs. They're able to funnel more electricity. They're able to afford for their kids to go to school. We think that that is what's happening as a result of exporting more goods. We think that that's what actually brings sustainability. Exporting does. And we think that that's why it's important to let China actually buy. Your point, Josh.
Right, which is exactly why we subsidize exporting through the Import-Export Bank. Even if we are just replacing the West with China, isn't that better from a business culture, environmental sustainability, and labor perspective?
No, and that leads me to my first point of positive matter, or of extension, which is the nature of developing economies, right? They seem to be treating Africa, they're like, well, they don't have the same standards that we do, or China doesn't have the same standards that we do. But there's a difference with developing economies. No developing economy has the same standards that we do. But when the US has invested in other countries, it has not increased their standards in terms of putting US businesses there. Having US businesses in India has not reduced the amount of child labor in India, right? There's still as much child labor. The second thing is with environmental. It's naturally in a developing economy that they're not going to have the same level of environmental protections that you have in a developed economy. It's ridiculous for side government to say, well, we need to keep no pollution abroad. Or in Africa. There's going to be pollution in Africa because they simply don't really know how to do it, and simply buying investments abroad It just doesn't change it. You shame me, but bring me an example of an example. No, thank you. Closing up, shame me, but bring me an example of developing economy that has a good, sustainable, environmentally friendly system. There isn't one. That's the fundamental issue here. China doesn't have a sustainable economy, or excuse me, like Africa doesn't have it. I'll take it back.
Okay, so perhaps the reason why you're lacking an example is because historically, the method for a developing country is one of colonial exploitation, which seems what your side is advocating.
No, it's what your side is advocating, right? It's saying that the U.S. needs to go save them, right? What we're saying is the countries can make their own decisions. If they want China to buy their goods, we can sell our own goods to China. There's no problem with that. What we're saying is don't let the U.S. go in, and that's uniquely bad for a couple reasons, and this is my second point of extension, right? Because we're buying to stop China. That's the whole goal, presumably, from the government side. But when we're clearly anti-China and we're trying to get the rest of the world to be anti-China, then we're clearly also being imperialistic. We're trying to get the whole world against China. That's the goal of the affirmative team's case, as specified in the resolution that's no longer up there. But it's the goal of what's being done. In order to make your foreign policy, to make other countries independently go against China, you have to be trying to impose the mindset in other countries that China isn't the best option. When you do that, you're imposing your mindset on other countries. And this really does undermine us. Number one, we've seen it when we've done it abroad in the past, right? When we've gone into the Middle East and tried to say, look, and I'm not even talking militarily, but even before that, when you said, look, you need to have democracy, your way of doing things isn't good, it led to the backlash against the US, and it means we can't speak into anything that they've actually done. We think this impacts in several different ways. Number one, when it's US-financed child labor, and we're making it clear that, look, go with us because we're better for you, if we say that, and finance child labor, and finance environmental disasters, we cannot advocate in any way for China to stop their child labor or environmental disasters. There's no place for the US to actually support the foreign policy objectives that basically we operate under. It undermines everything we do. The second thing is it undermines us in those actual countries. We have no right to go tell South Africa to treat their mine workers better if we're not treating the mine workers any better in Ethiopia, where they want us to be. When you link the US to the imperialistic policy, you undermine the fact that we cannot have a good example. No one is an example of success at that point, and everyone will resort to child labor. Everyone will resort to environmental disaster. We think that's the real problem, because you're taking away the incentive to do better. And for that reason, we're proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the member of opposition for his very eloquent remarks. Now I'd like to welcome the government whip opposing debate for the government side. Here.
Very degrading conception of the continent of Africa coming out of opposition today, where they seem to think that the African people are just helplessly waiting for someone to step in and exploit them and tell them what to do. What we actually see happening, and the reality of the situation in Africa, is that, as my partner Mariel told you, we're seeing countries on the very verge of true economic development, on the verge of developing their own institutions so they can be their own sustainable countries. African countries don't want to be beholden to the will of anyone. I'd suggest they'd rather see themselves as countries that can operate on the world market just like any other country. What we think the key difference is between a Western policy that supports investment and a Chinese policy that supports exploitation purely for the benefit of China is that on our side of the house, does the West benefit economically? Sure. But Africa benefits economically too and becomes a more sustainable part of the world. This is what opposition isn't getting. This is why government's clearly winning today. I'm going to crystallize this debate in two ways. First, I'm going to articulate what the harm is in allowing China's exploitation of African resources, of African land, why we think it's particularly harmful. Second of all, I'll talk about how Western investment creates a stronger, more sustainable Africa, why we'd rather see that happening today. First, some points of refutation. First of all, he says, we have this idea where he says, they should just sell off all of their resources for capital. Like, just get one big export boom and they'd be fine. We don't seem to understand from all that is that perhaps there are better ways to be doing this. For instance, coltan, which is a resource that's found in many places in Africa, in abundance there, can be used to, is one of the main components in computers and cell phones. We think that if instead of just selling all of your coltan to someone else who's making cell phones and computers, if you take the coltan and develop domestic industries so that you yourself can make those things, you'll make a lot more money and you'll be able to start up a lot better industries. I think better use. You can't get that unless you have initial investment from perhaps foreign investors, like perhaps the West. But But what happens with that is you have people being paid higher wages, you're developing industries, and you're making more money, which is sustainable, which means you have a longer period where you're making money as opposed to one short burst and then crap, there's no more coalting. He says developed countries will always be inefficient. Like, this is the way it's always been. And I ask in a POI and don't really get an answer to. Maybe that's because countries have always been exploiting them. The reason why developing countries have frequently had major problems with their industries is because other countries are just waiting and saying, let me take advantage of resources. Let me do this because it will benefit America, like when we set up banana republics in Latin America. Or let me just do this because it will be beneficial for me, the home country. Like, you want Belgium in taking control of the Congo. But we think that just because that's always been the case in the past doesn't mean it necessarily has to be the case in the future. And the model proposed by open government is clearly very different from a colonialist model that has been the case in history. What we're proposing is targeted investments, benefits for the particular businesses there. That do they bring money to the West? Sure, but while they're doing that, they're definitely bringing money to Africa. This brings me to my next point. He says, well, we're buying to stop China. We're buying to stop China. And this is imperialism. Like, not necessarily, because in this case, as I've said again, Africa's benefiting from all this. We're not just taking their land and raping their resources. We're setting up their own sustainability so that they can operate with us on an international scale. Sure. That's better from them. We don't necessarily see why that's clearly imperialist. He says, well, this will undermine our like reputation on the world. We think, no, we're probably more likely to build lots of new partners because there's lots of new countries who go, wow, the US is the country that took that step when we were on the verge of economic development. They're the one who was willing to invest in us when we needed it. That makes us seem better. That makes us seem stronger. And China will continue to trade with us because we're the biggest economy in the world, unlike what opposition thinks. Moving on. So what is the harm in allowing China's exploitation of African resources? So first of all, we think that as we've told you on the second government, Africa is at a critical stage where they're on the verge of development. We're seeing this in many countries around the world. We're seeing this in countries like Nigeria, which actually, unlike this sort of backwater land of rape and lions conception we're getting out of opposition, is really a rather developed country that has like many of its own industries. The problem is there are lots of other countries in Africa, I'll take you up to this point, countries like Cameroon, Ethiopia, or Kenya, that are starting to develop their own domestic industries. That's for you, Paul. They're starting to develop their own domestic industries, and they're wanting to be able to trade on an international level. What happens when China comes in and just says, we're going to buy up all of these things for ourselves? We think it's highly problematic. Sure.
You accuse us of saying we know what's best for India. Or not for India, but for Africa. But what you're saying is that Africa's decisions are bad and you can't manage your own economy. We know what to do. We should fix it for you.
What I'm saying is that Africa's realization that they lack capital to invest doesn't make them weak, it makes them realist. And when they realize that they lack capital to invest and they say, who will invest in our capital? If the West, which has shitloads of capital, wants to invest in it, maybe that's a good idea. Maybe everyone can win. Oh my God, what a crazy idea. So we think that these African nations that have abundant resources, that if we see China come in, or really any power, we just pick China because they're the one that's likely to do it. Like if Russia were doing it, we wouldn't like them doing it either. But a country that comes in and wants to have an exploitative model, where they're saying, we'll take these resources at any cost necessary, we'll like lower workers' rights, we'll do all these things, because it's what's best for China, not what's best for Africa. Because as Mario said, China can just leave Africa. They can strip it dry, take all the resources they need, and go back to China. Africa can't leave Africa. When those resources are gone, they're gone. And what they're left with is a lack of industry, and they're right back where they were when Belgium left Africa, when other countries left. They're left with serious harms that occur from this. We think also there are serious environmental and cultural harms that are identified. We think that China has shown time and time again, they don't really care what they do, they don't really care what they're doing to their own indigenous peoples and their own cultural artifacts. When China built the Three Gorges Dam, they were sort of like, oh no, we're going to destroy a whole bunch of cultural stuff. Oh well, when China gets involved in Tibet, they're like, we're gonna destroy their indigenous culture and totally trample all over this. They're like, what's important for China is profitability. What's important for China is creating the bottom line. That's really all they're caring about. And we're talking about a place like Africa, which isn't even if they're willing to do that to China, what the hell are they going to do to Africa? It's unlikely they're going to consider these to be valid environmental concerns. They're not going to consider the long term. They're unlikely to consider the events that have happened in the past and the kinds of things that have occurred there. They're just going to do what's best and strip resources there, which we think is incredibly harmful. How do we contrast this with the way Western involvement occurs? How is Western involvement not this explanation? Before I move on, sure.
All right, all of this assumes that Africans will buy, when we've clearly proven from opening opposition that China can outbid us at every turn. All of the benefits fall. What are we left with?
Stop. So here's why. So if I come to you and you're let's say I'm an African country, I have these two deals on the table. If the only deal on the table is China and that's the only I'm going to make money, I'm probably likely to take that. However, if I have this second deal, which is investment, and because I'm not like some caveman, which is your conception of that, I look at this and I go, wait a minute, does this mean that I'll develop long-term investments and have a sustainable country? I'm likely to choose that one, even though it might mean that I'm going to make less money in the short term, I'm going to make more money in the long term. That conception there, which is a better system there. So why is Western development better? Because it's long-term investments. But we recognize that you might be making less money to start. What you are doing is creating domestic industries and supporting those domestic industries through direct investment.
What that means is that you're able to have like a slow development of these countries getting more money within the country, which means there's more money to spend within the country, which means you're able to tax more money, which is what my partner Meryl was talking about, which means you're able to create up infrastructure systems, like better education systems, like better healthcare systems. And all of this is like an exponential growth. So once your country gets pushed over that verge, you'll very quickly start to develop. And we've seen this occurring in a country like Nigeria that hit a critical point of development, which was very good for them. When you create money within countries, you allow these countries to be better. They have a strong incentive to take this option, and taking this option facilitates benefits for them, facilitates benefits for us. It's a win-win situation that we think is better for business, is better for these people, and facilitates human rights. We're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Governor Whip for his very eloquent remarks, and I'd like to welcome the Opposition Whip to conclude the debate for today as a whole. Hear, hear.
So the two questions we want to ask at the end of today's debate round: is this good for Western foreign policy goals as a whole, and is this going to be good for Africa? And we believe the answer to both questions is going to be no, and we'll show you why. But first, I want to go through a few quick points of rebuttal over what the government team said in their last speech. Okay, so they're accusing us of saying that Africa can't make their own decisions. Our clear response is, well, you're saying that Africa's making bad decisions too. They also don't solve for they talk about the issue of, well, the reason Africa is going with China is because China offers them bribes. They don't ever solve for this at all, unless they're advocating that the West takes the bribe as well. They also talked about how developing countries have bad infrastructure because they're being exploited. Our clear response is, well, who's exploiting India? Who's exploiting Brazil? Their economies are developing, and they're not getting rid of their bad labor standards, and they're not getting rid of their environmental harms. If they think that they're going to solve all these problems just by having Western countries invest, and just by building infrastructure, they're fooling themselves, because this is empirically false. Okay? They also talked about how Western development is long-term, and this is something that we saw mostly coming out of the back half speech. And I'd like to remind them about what the U.S. has done to countries like Costa Rica in the 1980s. When we had free trade agreements with them, then the companies moved in for 2 years, set up plantations, and then moved back out, and all the people lost their jobs again. There's not a great record in terms of Western countries here. Do you disagree?
Right. But clearly, if you paid attention to the model, you'd see that what we're doing is not setting up banana republics, but facilitating investments in these countries so they can develop their own economies. That's totally different from the situation of a country like Costa Rica.
Well, then this is different than what you're talking about as well, because you're talking about how Western countries are coming in and they're going to be better in all this. If they're being run by Africans, then you have a lot of the same problems. But I'll be talking about why that's bad specifically. First, I want to bring things down to three points. The first two deal with how this is going to be harmful for Africa, and the third is going to be how this is bad for the foreign policies as a goal. So first of all, I'd like to point out that they don't really ever solve any of their problems. First of all, because the issue of bribes is not solved. This hasn't been something that's been emphasized throughout the round, but one of the reasons they gave for China having an advantage over the U.S. is not just they're there and we're not. They're offering bribes and we're not. This is never solved. The second thing is that child labor is not solved by U.S. investment. Again, we would point you to the examples of India and Brazil. No, thank you. And the U.S. companies still buy from them, and they set up other companies under pseudo-names just like it. And that brings me to my second main point here, which is satellite companies. We think this is something that's been very, very much underrepresented in all cases, all right? Because the U.S. comes in, and while the U.S. companies, due to international standards, do have environmental and labor regulations, what happens is they just create a spin-off company which technically a different company, so that they don't have to follow these environmental regulations.
On that point.
And my partner brought this up, and he talked about it in detail. So what happens is we set up these spin-off oil companies in the Niger River Delta that also dump oil into the river. We set up these child labor factories in Africa that also exploit people, and they have terrible environmental records, et cetera, et cetera. And furthermore, if we're going to be investing in African businesses, they also have these problems. There's not really a way that this is solved.
On that point?
They say that, well, yeah, okay, Western involvement is going to be better because it's long term, and we're going to be able to establish these relations with them. But we again say, no, this is not really true because we haven't seen it be true. These people, assuming their officials are corrupt, they're not going to become less corrupt because there's more factories in their country. Yeah?
So we'd say that we're never going to get a perfect Africa or perfect Western companies in Africa. But at the margin, if you subsidize some Western involvement in some African companies, there are going to be more, leading to good things like better labor standards and fewer bribes.
No, not really, because if you just create more companies in a certain location, that doesn't do anything to labor standards. There's no link there. Okay, now let's move on to the final point of this round, which is really how this is going to hurt Western foreign policy goals as a whole. All right, what this resolution was really supposed to be about was preventing China from investing in Africa, all right? And we're going to assume that the world will clearly see this as something that's anti-China. Now, we believe that this is a huge deal, and it's a huge impact for foreign policy goals for the U.S. and other countries abroad, okay? So what happens? We're saying, well, the U.S. and other Western countries, we're okay doing this, but China is not. And as the last speaker said, Russia is not either. Who can do it? Well, just us, because only we're good at doing this, and only we should be allowed to do this, all right? I've already taken 2 questions. The reason why this is problematic is because this is extremely hypocritical. We're the ones saying that we're protecting their sovereignty and we believe that they should make choices on their own, but they shouldn't listen to anyone but us and they shouldn't accept money from anyone but us. Okay? So what does this do to our reputation abroad? This is disastrous to our reputation because with the Western foreign policy goals, which are broadly working for democracy and working for economic development, these goals require cooperation from all parties. Again, I've already taken 2 questions. You can save your legs. They require cooperation from the countries. And are they going to cooperate with a country that they see as well, I don't know, saying that you should only listen to us, and they see as being imperialist? No, they're not going to. All right, this is going to hurt our efforts abroad. And we've seen this in several instances, most notably in the Middle East, where they look for any excuse they can to undermine what the U.S. is doing in that situation. Furthermore, this makes Africa mad because, again, we're creating the perception that China, it's not okay for China to come in, but it's okay for us. Now, you can look at that broad hurt to our foreign policy goal. This will hurt us specifically in our ability to deal with African countries. This will hurt us specifically in our ability to deal with China and a lot of their human rights abuses, which we are actively trying to stem. But furthermore, in the Western foreign policy goals abroad, if we're taking an entire continent and saying, no, only listen to us, you should only listen to us, don't accept money from anyone else, this is clearly being imperialist to the Africans who have recently emerged from this imperialism, but to a lot of other people. And what makes matters worse is that we're going to be setting up factories and companies that are going to be exploiting the people and hurting the environment. So we're saying, no, you shouldn't listen to China because they hurt the environment. But when we hurt the environment, that's okay because we're doing a long-term investment to help you with your child labor and hurting the environment. This doesn't make any sense, all right? So we believe the best course of action here is to allow Africans to actually make their own decisions. But furthermore, don't get the U.S. tangled up in this hypocritical thing which won't solve the problem and will only exacerbate anti-Western foreign policy sentiment. All right? The best course of action is to vote for the opposition. Thank you.
Very eloquent remarks and congratulate the speakers on competing in the final round here at Binghamton.